It is now my distinct pleasure and honor to hereby commence what will surely be an outstanding conference by turning things over to Will Conway, who will chair our first session.
Hi, I'm Will Conway. I'm a graduate student. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a white male with brown hair in a blue plaid shirt. I have the distinct pleasure of chairing this first session entitled Projecting Risk, Doing Philosophy Together, Projecting Risk, Doing Risk Together, and Disability Justice. Today, we will be joined by Melinda C. Hall, who is an associate professor and the chair of philosophy at Stetson University. Hall is also the director of Stetson's Gender Studies program there, as well as the director of the Community Education Project, which is Stetson's higher education program related to prisons and incarcerated peoples. She also coordinates the blog, which many of you know, Biopolitical Philosophy With, who was just speaking, Shelley Tremaine. Hall's primary focus circulates around the relationships between bioethics, continental philosophy, and of course, the philosophy of disability. Her book, The Bioethics of Enhancement, Transhumanism, and Biopolitics, utilizes Foucauldian methodology to demonstrate that disability is central to the debate over human advancement. Hall's academic research is published in DSQ, the International Journal of Feminist Approaches to Bioethics, the Philosophy Compass, and other places. So before we get started, I would just like to remind everyone of the function of Q&A, as well as the function for upvoting. So if everyone could just take a look at that module there and make sure that they understand it, that would be wonderful. And now I would love to turn it over to Melinda Hall.
Thank you so much, Will. That was so kind. Thank you for your introduction. I do want to clarify that Shelley Tremaine does by far the lion's share of the work over at Biopolitical Philosophy, and I'm very happy to help in the background, in the structure of the blog and the support of it, and whenever I can to contribute there. But thank you very, very much, Will. And now I'll share my screen, and what I hope you'll see will be my presentation only. There we go. So I am a white woman with brown shoulder length hair, and I am wearing a sort of turtleneck, green turtleneck, and I'm in an office space. So my project is entitled Projecting Risk, Doing Risk Together, and Disability Justice. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I have been now working on this range of questions for, I think, 5 years. This is by and far, the longest that I've spent on a scholarly project. And of course, there are reasons for that I know that you'll all be familiar with, including but not limited to university workings during COVID, child raising during COVID. And I'm very glad to share a little bit about this project and where I am with it now with you today. So on my first slide here, I have an image made by Luciano Olazabal, who it's a beautiful sort of hand-drawn illustration that I thought captured ideas of risk-taking as a collective. Two brown pairs of hands are catching a smaller group of people of different ages, and there's a group of persons sort of behind the two hands that are providing that catching. So Will has already said a little bit about my work, so I won't say much more except to say a little bit, as I did last year, about some of my sort of commitments within philosophy. So much of my work in philosophy of disability is informed by critical disability theory, which is interdisciplinary. And the move there is to always analyze disability as a cultural, historical, relative, social, and political phenomenon. So there's a move to denaturalize disability, to look at, as Shelley phrased it, social power, and to consider a variety of lenses for theorizing about disability and I will say too, as Sammy Schulk puts it, this involves scrutinizing not bodily or mental impairments, but the social norms that define particular attributes as impairments. So following Tremaine, I do endorse a concept of impairment by which we can consider it to be fundamentally political or political and social in nature. As well, and then critical disability theory and philosophy of disability focus on those social conditions that concentrate those stigmatized attributes in particular populations. And I find that this is a really helpful, I tend to have these thoughts up as I'm working and these definitions forward as I am presenting my work. So just to sort of clarify again, I would argue that disability is not natural, it is produced, and my Foucauldian commitments and my background and work with Michel Foucault helps me strategize about how to theorize disability. Of course, in theorizing disability, and as Tremaine argues, its precursor and impairment as political, that does not mean that they are not real. And I think I'll skip over that for the moment in the interest of time. As I said, I've been working on this project for probably 5 years. I'm really stuck on the concept of risk and find it extremely fruitful for philosophy of disability. In fact, I think that looking at the construction of disability and sites of its construction through the lens or through attention to how risk is distributed and how responsibility for risk is attributed is helpful and fruitful, and I'm trying to track that down. So I'm interested in, and I shared this in my presentation last year as well, reframing ethical issues presented by dominant understandings of risk, uncovering how individuals and populations are positioned in dominant discourses as subjects at risk or risky subjects. And I do that using case studies, including police brutality, climate change, and other case studies around viral illness and environmental disaster. And I'm interested in reversing and collectivizing the management of risk. And that sort of positive portrait or positive picture is what I want to look at today. So last year I presented on a portion of this project, and I just want to use it to set up what I'll be talking about today, because this description of the sort of critical portion of my project is the background against which the positive picture makes sense. So essentially, I wanted to bring risk discourses themselves under moral evaluation. What I found largely when I looked at the philosophy of risk is that the momentum in discussions of philosophy of risk goes in a different direction. It primarily looks at the ethics of communication. Of course, that's not always and only discussions about risk, but within ethics discussions, within discussions of social and political power, what you often saw is a discussion of risk that focuses on ethics of communication. So I wanted to take those communications under the microscope and look at them and think about morally evaluating the discourses themselves. So last year, I argued that in a productive failure, risk communications, particularly public health risk communications, individualize responsibility for risk. In other words, it counts as an instance of responsibilization, pulling from Foucault on individualization and neoliberalism, really, and then Catherine Mills on responsibilization. And I also argued that risk discourses increase harms for disabled people. So I'm very careful. I want to not say it increased risks for disabled people. I'm thinking about harms and further marginalization and trying to interrupt the language of risk. And so all of this is part of my critical project in my book. And so to summarize this a little bit, where I sort of ended and where I was about a year ago was to suggest that, within the COVID setting, that there's responsibilized responses and then collectivized responses. And I looked to mutual aid organizations and disaster relief to consider these concepts. And I did find that when you focus on staying at home, washing your hands, social distancing, and wearing a mask, these individualized responses to COVID, what that would do is sort of increase, again, the harms for marginalized folks, because not everyone can participate in these actions. Whether or not you can stay home, work remotely is obviously highly contingent on privilege and on your social status. And a lot of folks are working jobs that require them to precisely ignore these sorts of guidelines. Meanwhile, sort of collectivized options that I was finding in a lot of the responses, political and social, to COVID included, of course, mutual aid, redistribution of funds, decarceration in order to reduce the public health threat in prisons. And that can involve releasing people early. It can involve all kinds of different activity to reduce the populations in prisons. Universal basic income might allow people to stay at home. Debt relief might allow people the wiggle room to keep themselves safe when they get sick. Online and remote work and learning also. So I want to recommend to you the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief National Grassroots Network as a group that I found really, really interesting. However, and this is where the positive portrait that I want to get to today comes in. I had, over the last, of course, 2 years and longer, I've been called in a variety of ways to support my university and its processes. And along the way, not only was I asked to do all kinds of activities to make sure the university could continue teaching and learning, I was also asked to sort of justify it or endorse it, everything that we were doing, both publicly and privately. So in talking with Stetson University's provost, he had read or heard some element of this project of mine, and he wanted to know if online learning and teaching was an action that counted as a collectivized risk project during COVID. And I said yes. I said yes. When we do something brand new like that, and it allows all kinds of new access to goods and social and political goods that weren't available before, then that is sort of a collectivized risk project. And of course, I was immediately unhappy that I said that, because although I don't think it's incorrect in the sense of being inaccurate, I do think it lacks political context and nuance. It's easy to see that online learning and teaching fails to challenge power asymmetries and structures that give rise to vulnerability. Indeed, I think that online learning and teaching fails to challenge the university itself, right? Including the circumstances of my own burnout and my own exploitation as a worker. So I want to go back to some of these examples of collectivized risk projects. One thing that each of them include is kind of reactive character. And I'm going to go back to that at the end of my presentation. But for today, I'd like to move beyond these examples to a more positive portrait that can have greater political nuance and context. So I have chosen to present today on my desire to do some meaning shifting. And of course, by me, I mean us, through collective action. I would like to see if we can play with the meaning of risk projection and move it from the meaning of probabilistic rationality and toward making a project of risk together. So instead of engaging in probabilistic rationality that obviates or that disallows for encounters with the truth or with experiences or with the future, that is, it covers over possibilities for the future, and attaches negative valence to marginalized groups, I would like to move toward concepts of project, human project. How do we understand risk as a project, something that we can do together? And I will say that I believe that this kind of shift could create material differences today and give rise to new coalitions and political solidarity, or that is the hope. So to say a little bit more, what is risk projection? Of course, we usually understand risk projection as an assessment of the probability of a negative outcome. So I've talked about this quite a bit, not only in this venue last year, but in other venues as I'm working on this project. But I refer to this sort of projection or statistical probability or rationality as a sort of technocratic matter, taken over by a variety of certifications and risk management strategies and styles, and professionals, risk management professionals. And what you'll see is that folks assign a numerical value in order to create predictions. The risk assessment will assume objective risk measures and acceptable levels of risk. So I have an example theorization of risk from public health on the slide, where you might equate risk to the multiplication of emissions, transport, loss factor, exposure period, uptake, and toxicity factor in a particular possible action. And then you think about what is my projected risk from taking that action in public health, or sorry, taking that, looking at a particular crisis in public health, or an action in public health. So how do I know that risk is sort of reliant on probabilities? Well, I think within even canonical literature in philosophy that is primarily interested in sussing out just what it is that risk is, what you get is the idea that risk, no matter what the definition, is based on some kind of subtle combination of knowledge and uncertainty. Of course, whenever we talk about risk, there's some kind of futurity there, a sort of unknown outcome. So there is going to be uncertainty, but for this uncertainty to come to us as a risk, says Sven Ove Hansen, something has to be known about it. That is that set of probabilities. The combination of knowledge and lack thereof contributes to making issues of risk so difficult to come to grips with. So really risk becomes this sort of attitude toward the future by which you can bring to the fore both what you know and what you don't know. But it will have to, if we're going to call it risk, be something that we can approach with some knowledge. So according to Hansen, in decision-making under risk specifically, we know what the possible outcomes are and what their probabilities are. And he wants to maybe even start to refer to any decision-making under risk as decision-making under known probabilities. Whereas if you're doing decision-making under uncertainty, your probabilities are either not known at all or only known with insufficient precision. And I want to link this to all kinds of work in the history of philosophy. I mean, my mind just sort of goes in a variety of directions. We have Adorno suggesting that Enlightenment rationality runs ahead of us and covers over possible encounters with difference, right? That we are caught up in a kind of totality that we can't sort of engage in a meaningful way. So I want to say, at least for now, that I think that statistics do cover over possible encounters, political possibilities, and possible futures. So perhaps we can use what feels really natural, existentialism and phenomenology, as a jumping off point for discussion of risk projects. Martin Heidegger, of course, was interested in the meaningful versus the real. You know, when I teach Heidegger to my students, I focus on that move away from a sort of objectivist framework, or I'll even say, you know, of course, in response to Aristotle, who's focused on being as the real, Martin Heidegger is looking to meaningfulness. And so if we were going to pick up on Heidegger's conversation about truth and disclosure and connect it back with Hansen, statistical probability, again, would cover over not disclosed possibilities. And I find that could be a helpful move. And of course, existentialists have a really strong phenomenological framework for theorizing human projects. And of course, so not really yet, but of course, these projects are always possible failures. So Heidegger, I think, carefully describes the possibility for meaning making and authenticity against the very possibility of failure. He describes idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity as paired with understanding, attunement, and authenticity, suggesting that that you cannot have that meaningfulness without the lack or the privation, or perhaps it's that you cannot fall prey. And this is where I can refer a little bit to Heidegger's text. We can't fall prey or get caught up in idle talk if it weren't the case that we were already concerned with understanding and attuned being in the world. And authentic existence too has this relationship with entangled everydayness. So I'm looking at sections of the text of Being in Time. Meanwhile, for Simone de Beauvoir, oppression and uncertainty undermine our projects. So she's fundamentally interested in uncertainty. She thinks that we can, of course, fail in engaging in our authentic projects, and she focuses quite a bit on the idea that part of that is due to the fact that they're unknowns. And Jean-Paul Sartre suggests, of course, that we have to take up our projects in despair, with the knowledge that we cannot control outside events or other people's actions, from his classic essay, Existentialism is a Humanism. So if we look more closely at this sort of path or thread, can we talk about risk as a project of meaning making that is not just a description of statistical probability? And if we want to follow the thread that potentially existentialism and phenomenology can be a jumping off point for theorizing about this, I think it's only right that we look at sort of the overall existential project that Heidegger offers. And of course, I worry that this isn't going to get me where I want to go, because it's not necessarily collectivist. It could be potentially, and I think there's a lot of room for conversation here. But in section 53, in book 2, I suppose, I don't, have it in front of me, and Being in Time, he describes the existential project of authentic being toward death. And usually sort of we're caught up in the second bullet point, you'll see his references. Usually we're caught up in the they self for Heidegger, we're lost, we're thrown, and we're in concern, sort of taking care of things. Also in care. So concern, I think, would be taking care of other beings like us. Whereas care for Heidegger would be taking care of sort of objects related to our worlding. But he says, even though we're usually like this, we could be in passionate, anxious freedom toward death, which is free of the illusions of the they, factical and certain of itself. So how can we think about this without sort of responsibilizing or individualizing? Sartre's notion of human projects is highly solitary, it seems. We've got the despair, we've got the sense that we're alone in this, that we have to be okay with being alone in this, that our meaning projects cannot depend on other people following suit. And Heidegger's passionate, anxious freedom toward death, is that solitary or individual? Is that something we can do together in a sort of crypt solidarity or crypt futurity? And I'd love to think about that. And I think that Heideggerian concern which shapes our encounters with others like us, is not necessarily an expression of solidarity, but again, perhaps it can be. I'd like to sort of loot to existentialism for the move to meaningfulness and away from probabilities and statistics. That is to think about, instead of a sort of set of statistics that we sort of know about that are true or accurate, but not disclosing a deeper experiential meaningfulness. I'd like to loot existentialism for that, but also find a more solid ground for collective projects. Because it seems to me that we don't have a collective action problem with regard to risk projects, but rather a sort of collective opportunity. Since neoliberal frameworks are individualizing, taking action together to interrupt those frameworks could be the pursuit of collectivizing risk. So I have a few examples of risking ourselves together. I also have some negative examples that I'm working with that I'm still not sure about. Each of these, you'll see there's a focus on economies, there's a focus on emotional, affective ties. There's a focus on building out access to knowledge that isn't gate-kept, and opening up to projects that aren't driven by profit. On my list, I include building alternative epistemic communities. I'm thinking of the hashtag NEIS void on Twitter, which stands for No End in Sight, where chronically ill folks and marginalized people, especially marginalized in the medical sense, from diagnoses that are appropriate or from medical care, get together and pool their knowledge about symptoms, about how to intervene, about how to shift in order to support each other in living better. I'm thinking also about so-called gynopunks and other groups that pool medical information online for women's health. In each of these cases, I think that I could say so much, and I'm thinking about these examples, and I'll try not to do that because of time and maybe not linger as much, but I'll just read the rest. Alternative access to teaching and learning. So I'm thinking about releasing or freeing knowledge from its gatekeeping behind university walls. Trans and queer affirmations, that is projects of expression, chosen families, building relationships, polyamorous collectivities. All of these things challenge normative engagements in the family. Safe injection sites, protest, transformative justice, general strike, collectively owned seed banks, and collectively owned biobanks. So seed banks are places where we stockpile seeds and diversity of seeds in order to deal with with the certain climate crisis and its potential problems. But most of those are not collectively owned. There's examples of state-owned seed banks. Biobanking, like outside the model of 23andMe, has interested me for quite a while. And then even joy, right? Just the ability to imagine a future. So some might object, right, that this is just another way to describe mutual aid structures or even political solidarity. And, that would be okay with me. But I would reply that I think that, of course, I still endorse mutual aid as crucial for disabled people, but it's largely reactive. It's largely responding. So for example, the National Bailout Fund here in the United States involves Black women all over the country leading efforts to collect money to get people out of prison once arrested, since I think 400,000 or so something people are incarcerated in the US just because they can't pay bail. A mutual aid, wonderful action, but it is not yet building something different like transformative justice might. And then I think that risking ourselves, sure, it's a kind of solidarity, and it emerges very specifically, I think, within a particular context, a context in which, and I'll go back to these examples, We don't have access to what we need for the future. We individualize, we pay, we suffer sort of alone, and are vulnerable in the face of powerful institutions. So, and I'll just say one more thing here. I want to show the kind of side-by-side, the way that I did with the COVID responses, with risk individualized or responsibilized, and then risk collectivized. I want to sort of deepen and show that I want to shift the statistical projections of risk that implicate and marginalize disabled people. I want to shift that to risk as a sort of project that we do together. And on that third bullet point, I provide an example only because I think it would be very mysterious if I didn't. What I have here is prenatal testing technologies counts disability, naturalizes disability, creates a statistical analysis. Whereas reframing well-being and denaturalizing disability has to be something we theorize about and collectivize around together. Sea level rise probabilities. How is it that we're going to deal with having 3 extra or 1.9 extra meters of water on our coastal, in our coastal counties and towns? Where are we going to move people, right? Building new capacities for living on or near water could be a collective risk project. And then, some folks in philosophy are talking about human engineering to mitigate climate change. And that's where I provide my example, just so it's less mysterious. For example, creating smaller children who will require less food. Obviously, this deeply implicates disability and needs to be contextualized. And I would say, how about we mitigate climate change through dismantling food distribution structures that waste energy and create malnutrition? Of course, it's just my political wish list, I suppose, so forgive me. In the final moment of my presentation, and then I promise I will wrap, I would say that this is about futurity, which is a really important thread in critical disability theory, including access to and dreams about the future. And I'm always really inspired by this subtle distinction that Raina Rapp and Faye Ginsburg make when they talk about the difference between making disability count for the future rather than counting disability. And they've written about this in a couple places. And I think that taking up risk is a collective project that interrupts probabilistic thinking and the marking of particular bodies as fit or not fit for particular eventualities has the potential to make disability count. So I'm gonna, in this section of my manuscript, head next to 3D printing, distributive and additive manufacturing, and blockchain. And I'm excited about these topics. I think it'll be really interesting research, or I hope it will. My interest sort of lies, of course, with the environment, with medicine, focusing primarily on disability. And also, I'm just interested in emerging technology and how it's framed as potentially liberating. I have some things to say about blockchain, but probably they're just provocations. In closing, thank you very much for attending my talk. I so look forward to attending the remainder of the talks in this program. And I appreciate everyone for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. So I'll ask one question and then I will turn it over to Jonathan. Again, we welcome everyone to put their questions into the Q&A. Hopefully with the two of us kicking it off, others will start to trickle in, but we know how these things go the very first conference. So it's fine. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was lovely. I have one question as someone who's interested in the relationship between critical phenomenology and critical disability studies. You cited the problems in a Heideggerian framework pertaining to disability. I'm wondering, since you also work in Foucault studies as well, in Foucault's remarks on Marx, his interview in Italy in 1977, he spoke briefly about the problem that phenomenology has with what was translated into English as like the common, the everyday, but it, frankly, a more adequate understanding for the English translation would have been like universal or totalizing. How, obviously, disability studies has had a long history of problems with phenomenology, as indicated early in late last political transition. How do you square the issue with wanting to utilize, say, what is left of Dasein analysis or like Husserlian phenomenology with the always encroaching problem that phenomenology has of sort of universalizing the body, universalizing modes of experience?
Thank you so much. And I mean, I think that, Merleau-Ponty is obviously involved in this conversation. This is something that, really matters. And I don't want to dismiss your question, but I think I want to say this. I think I want to say, I want to use the good stuff like everyone else does on behalf of philosophy of disability. Like that word looting, which I've, well, you're aware that I want to maybe use it like potentially in another project. I think, I think that what I want to do is say, that we don't have to settle on the description of the move from the objectivist to the meaningful, settle on a universalizing move or like the epoche or like cutting out like difference. I think that left to itself, though, that, Heidegger as a figure is using him is not going to solve my problems. It's just a sort of, as I say, a sort of jumping off point. I'm still in the space always of thinking about curiosity, innovation, and refusal of the status quo in this Foucauldian sense. And maybe part of the refusal of the status quo is rereading the canon, looting it for structures that can be used in new ways. And so the reason I said I don't want to dismiss is, of course, that kind of sounds like a non-answer, which I appreciate. But I do think that the problems are there, but that I as a philosopher of disability, or I as a philosopher who wants to do critical work on disability, should be allowed to have at the canon in just the same way that other folks have. And I think people have really, used Heidegger, taken the good parts. Kind of a ridiculous answer, I know, but thank you, Will, for your question.
No, that was a great answer. So I'm just going to turn it now over to Jonathan, who has a question.
Thanks so much, Melinda, and thank you, Will. So this was such a fascinating talk for me because I've worked on the ethics of risk and I've worked on disability, and I've never thought of putting them together like this. And I come at risk from much more the Hansen than the Heidegger approach. I've got a couple of suggestions and wonder what you think of them. So one of the things I've done in thinking about risk and vulnerability is putting it in your frame of, if you individualize risk and make people responsible for dealing with risk themselves, very often what they do is take different risks. So if you think about your COVID cases, you stay at home because you don't want to get COVID, so you can't feed your family. So individualizing, so this is another argument for you against individualizing risk, because it often multiplies when people take those strategies, right? So this is something that Avner de Chalis and I wrote about in our book Disadvantage. But the immediate challenge for me was when you said ethics of risk to this point hasn't politicized risk. I thought, okay, that's me. Have I not politicized risk? And what I've done, and I think you're doing something different to me. So what I did, I started with dissatisfaction over the definition of risk as harm times probability, as capturing everything. And because I thought that we react differently to the same risks understood that way, dependent on its cause. So the cause of the hazard can be very influential on how we think about it, and that brings in a political dimension. But interesting to me, that's not what you talked about. So you talked about a fourth thing, I think, which is the response to the risk. And so it seems to me what you're doing is thinking that for any given risk, there's more than one possible response or remedy. And the remedy we choose is the political act. So that would be, to put your Heideggerian existentialist reflections, I suppose, much more into an analytic frame, where we say, we've got a fourth variable, and maybe in the framing of the harm actually as well, the framing of the harm is political. The probability could be political because you choose your reference group if you've got a frequency theory. The cause is political, but the response is definitely political. And that's where you're doing your work. So I don't know if that resonates with you or whether I've misunderstood what you're doing.
No, it certainly resonates. And I appreciate your generosity in sharing those thoughts, especially as someone who I was kind of framing potentially unfairly. I think that you're absolutely right to say that risk has been politicized differently than what I'm doing in the past. So I would reference things like the cultural theory of risk, or the idea that, well, folks just have different values that yields like different prioritizations of risk. And of course, in sociology, folks want to talk about these cultures of risk, right? And so that's one way of politicizing. And then I think that your discussion of the cause of the hazard is actually important to me, because what I'm thinking is that the fourth thing that you were referencing, the response to risk, is actually, well, not actually, it's a response to crisis. So there's a crisis, and we have, sure, like in a more analytic frame, maybe we could call it a decision point. Like there's an opportunity, we have a crisis and something's unfolding. And what I want us to see is that the future has more possibilities than what we believe, because the statistical probabilities that we're doing run ahead of our encounter with the future. So what I think is that actually the cause of the hazard thing that you're discussing and politicizing does have a connection, because I want to look at crises and not give over right away to the idea that we know just what's going to happen. And so I appreciate what you said, and I've taken some notes here on your suggestions. I appreciate very much.
Thank you so much for your question. So we have one question here from Andrea Pitts. Hi, Dr. Hall. Thank you so much for this amazing work. This sounds like a fantastic and important project. I recently taught Alexis Shotwell's critical remarks about HIV criminalization, and specifically, we discussed her responses to containment of the virus versus care models addressing the risk of HIV transmission. I was wondering whether your work might be able to address risk management in sexual health contexts, and if so, what does collectivizing risk in sex practices or sexual health look like? Thanks so much for this talk.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Dr. Pitts, I really so nice to hear from you, and I appreciate your question. I so very much admire Alexis Shotwell's work, especially her book Against Purity, which has been like very helpful for me in thinking about climate crises. For sexual health and HIV criminalization, or that sort of like realm, I would again turn toward, I think I may have something to develop there with regard to gatekeeping needed materials or needed information. So I want to refer back to this idea of the Gynapunk, which I think is really evocative, during which sort of heyday, people gathered information about sexual health and reproductive health and all kinds of different things online on private servers that they would then have peer-to-peer networking to access. And I think that what you saw was the creation of a sort of alternative, what I was describing as alternative epistemic community. And so I will certainly, I am going to look into this idea of the containment of the virus versus a care model. But I would suggest that what we're talking about when we talk about sexual health is so often gatekeeping needed resources and care. And that if we're going to have a different sort of situation arise that can better handle the crisis, I would always look to communities in which those resources were shared or replicated or given for free or used together. So I don't think I have a sense of exactly where that would go yet, but I think it fits within or can build. I can use that to continue on in the discussion of these sort of alternative communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the next question comes from S.J. Beard. Thank you so much, Melinda. I work in the field of existential risks of human extinction, which is very obscuring. We are just starting to bring disability into this space. And I think one point I'm keen to make is that disabled people are just experts at confronting and working with vulnerabilities, while others have the privilege of ignoring them. To what extent do you think risking ourselves requires that risk management builds on the structures disabled people create for themselves, for ourselves?
Yeah, thank you so much. There's so much there. I mean, I think that I made an excited face when you mentioned existential risk, because some of the work that I've been trying to do, whether or not it's successful, I don't know, is to respond to literature that precisely says that it wants to deal with risks of human extinction. Like we have existential risks, so we have to do something quite different if we're going to meet that, right? And so the human engineering discussions in climate change mitigation get involved here, but also, Savulescu and Person's 2013 book on morality enhancement fits here too. And I definitely am very interested in that topic and interrupting it because, as you say, it's obscuring. I think that Heidegger can help us too think how we're not going to experience, or that existential risk is sort of an abstraction from our experiences. But yeah, in terms of your question, I think that disabled people's knowledge is exploited all the time, especially during COVID. I think that people were right to point out in social media and in different ways that a lot of the tactics and the things that folks were doing to stay safe were things that disabled people have been doing for a very long time, and that they had sort of been swept aside even while their knowledge was being exploited. And so I think that there's a bad side to this, or a exploitative side to this, but I also think that that's right. Building a future requires disabled people. Yeah, absolutely. Counting disabled people in, following Rapp and Ginsburg. Thank you.
Okay, so it seems like we have reached our time for this panel. Obviously, we don't want to take too much time from other panels. So thank you so much, of course, Melinda, for your wonderful presentation. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out to her if you have more questions. There's a reason her email was included in the materials. So with that, thank you so much. And I will turn it over to Shelley Tremaine to close this section.
And thank you, Will, so much. Thank you.